Hi everyone, welcome back. We are about to start the afternoon session, which will be dedicated to one topic only, which is aggregates. Aggregate is a complicated topic, but one cannot start an implementation without fully understanding it, because under the current modeling, almost all resources an aggregate. To this session, we have invited a total of 6 guests. The first of them will point out in their presentation what they see problematic in RDA's current aggregate handling. After them, we have a short break. Then the former members of the RSC aggregate working group will respond to their points and answer our questions. The first presenter is Heidrun Wiesenmüller from the Hochschule der Medien, Stuttgart. You may know her from ELA's RDA mailing list or from our events. The title of her presentation of Apple's Glue and Occam's Razor, a critical look at the theory of aggregates. Heidrun, you have to.
Right. So just sharing my screen. And now you should all see my my slides. Right, so I'm going to give you a critical look at the theory of aggregates. And let's have a very short look back at the history of the aggregates model. And you may remember that there was in 2011 the final report of the IFLA working group on aggregates. And you may also remember that there was disagreement among the group. So there was one winner model, but there was also an alternative approach championed by a part of this group. And you can find this in Appendix B of this document. The winner model, I can remember that quite clearly, was widely discussed and also criticized, for example, on the RDA list. Then in 2017, we've got the IFLA LRM. And interestingly, the working group's winner model was adopted mostly verbatim. So there were only really very small changes, but no reappraisal of the matter. And then, of course, now we have official RDA, which spells out the model for practical implementation. Now, if we have a short look at the loser model, what they stated was that aggregates exist on all VEMI levels. So in a way, they just said an aggregate entity is the whole in a whole part relationship. So we can imagine this like this. We have an aggregate work, which is made up of, say, 2 single works as its parts. The works, again, have expressions. So there is also an aggregate expression. The aggregate work is realized by the aggregate expression. Then, of course, we have manifestations. So there is also an aggregate manifestation, and the aggregate expression is embodied in the aggregate manifestation. This seems intuitively correct, but there are indeed problems with this kind of modeling, and I'll come back to this at the very end of this presentation. Now, let's have a look at the winner model. And I'll do that very quickly because I assume you all know that. They stated that there is only one aggregate level, and that is the aggregate manifestation. But they introduced the so-called aggregating work and aggregating expression. You may remember this bit. I'm not reading it out, but just to remind you, they said the aggregating work is the process of aggregating the expressions. They also called it the glue binding or the mortar between the expressions. And they also pointed out that the aggregating work is not a discrete section. It's not even an identifiable part of the resulting manifestation. And especially also, it does not contain the aggregated works themselves. At some other bit, they explained that the aggregating work is really the decisions for selection and arrangement. That's the work. You also will remember this diagram. I think it's quite well known. I always love that they call it simple and straightforward, because I don't think it is simple and straightforward, but just notice that there is the aggregate manifestation, but there is no aggregate expression or aggregate work above it. Instead, you have on the one hand side the ordinary works with their embodied expressions, and I call this, just for a metaphor, I call the ordinary works now the apple works. So these are the ordinary works, and on the other hand, you have the aggregating work with its expression, and this is also embodied in the aggregate manifestation. And taking up this metaphor of the glue, I call this a glue work. Right, so let's look a bit more closely. And one of my questions is, are these glue works really works? If we remember what the definition of a work is, in Ferber, it is a distinct intellectual or artistic creation, and in the LRM, it's the intellectual or artistic content of a distinct creation. Now compare this to our definitions and explanations of the aggregating work, and quite interestingly, there are several. The working group said this glue, binding, or mortar, which of course is not a definition, it's just metaphors. Then at another page, they say it's the effort such as the selection and arrangement decisions. We just saw this bit. Now, if you look in the LRM, I was quite amazed to find two different explanations, because on page 21, it's the concept or plan for the selection, assembly, and ordering. Whereas on page 94, it's the selection and arrangement criteria, which I believe is not exactly the same thing. And then in RDA, as you all know, it's a plan to select and arrange two or more expressions. Well, whatever you take, to me personally, I think it's very difficult to think of something like this as distinct and as a creation, because usually the creation is what we used to think of as the aggregate work, which no longer exists by definition. Note that whenever I talk about an aggregate work, I put the dagger sign behind it to express that it is diseased, because it's no longer part of the model. I'd say that the glue is just the means to this end, to achieving this result. Also, if we accept that something like this is a distinct creation and therefore a work, then I think we have to ask, what about, say, if I decide to write a textbook or a story or a novel or whatever? This is also a plan. Why isn't this plan also a work in its own right? Now, there are other things which are quite amazing about these glue works. And one is what I call the abundance of glue works. And I really had to think of the Goethe House at Weimar, where you have this lovely view from one room to the other. And it's a bit like this with these aggregating works. Let's take as an example an edited collection. I've made that up, an edited collection on the topic of artificial intelligence by a number of editors. One of them is called Sue Miller. We'll come to her back later. Now, if you want to make such an edited collection, what happens is that the editors start out with a vague idea. Then they'll ask people to contribute. So there will be a draft list of contributors. There certainly will be changes to this list. There will probably be at some stage a draft order of the essays, and then they might readjust it. Then the text come in, and each text is edited in many ways. Now, these are all quite normal steps, but every of these steps represents a new glue work, a new aggregating work, so that in fact, you have not only one aggregating work, but you have a weird chain of aggregating works. So I just wanted to, well, a number of works, but some final stage. Then there will be the aggregating work, which leads to the publishing of the aggregate manifestation. Now, if you compare this to an ordinary work, an Apple work, of course, we have similar steps like this. If, for example, I write a textbook, but these steps are considered to be differences on the expression level, and I find this odd. But okay, let's treat the glue like a work. And then I think we have to ask, how can we describe it? Which elements can we use? And if we take the theory seriously, I think that we need to distinguish this glue work from the result, which also means that in the case of my invented edited collection on artificial intelligence, let's say the title is Algorithms of Power, we cannot use this title of the compilation as the title of the aggregating work. Instead, I think we'd need to devise a preferred title, something like Plan for the Edited Collection on Artificial Intelligence. While the creators are obviously the editors of this collection, in many cases, we will not even know them. So if you want to make an authorized access point, it could look like this with our first editor, Miller Sue, Plan for Edited Collection on Artificial Intelligence. I'm sure you find this as weird as I do. Date of work, I think we could use the year of publication. Category of work, that's easy. It's an aggregating work. Nature of content, I don't think this is applicable at all because it doesn't really have content. So these are, well, interesting questions, I think, for how can I describe such a glue work. Another point which I wondered about is think of a case where different creators aggregate the same expressions. This is a made-up example, but I think you could easily have something like this. For example, two editions of Alice in Wonderland with the identical text and identical illustrations, published, say, 20 years apart in by different publishers. And what about this? Now, if it's the identical plan, then it should be the same glue work. However, if we've got different creators, this normally leads to different works. So again, this is a very, very odd kind of work. But it gets even odder if we turn to the expression, the aggregating expression, which is a complete mystery to me. The definitions of expression in Ferber, it's the intellectual or artistic realization of a work in the form of alphanumeric and so on notation. In the LRM, it is a distinct combination of signs conveying intellectual or artistic content. Now, I looked up the working group's paper and the LRM, and interestingly, I did not find a definition or explanation for the aggregating expression. RDA does it bravely. They give both a definition. Well, the definition is the aggregating expression realizes the plan. Okay. More interesting, I think, is this bit where they give an explanation. And they say the content of the aggregating expression is what is in the aggregate manifestation and does not belong to the ordinary expressions. So they state that a title page, page headings, and numbering in a printed volume aggregate could be considered as the content of the aggregating expression. Again, I think this is weird because think, for example, of such a case. We have a collection of 3 novels of the same author, and we have, say, 2 editions. And in one edition, these novels are named on the title page. In the other, they aren't. Or think about differences in numbering, like Arabic numerals and Roman numerals. Well, to me, the explanation in RDA seems to imply that differences such as this should be treated as different aggregating expressions, and this also leads to different aggregating works. But to my mind, I think this should be differences on the manifestation level only. So another oddity. But okay, let's treat it like an expression, and again, look, how could we describe it? Which elements could we use? Ooh, well, what about the preferred title of the expression? I've got question marks. Now, if you say you accept this RDA explanation, then maybe it would be all right to use the title proper of the manifestation. However, I think this is weird again because this title identifies the result and not the process, the realization of the plan. Creators, well, they are probably the same as the creators of the glue work, so it should be the editors. Content type, I don't think that's applicable. Language and script depends. If you accept the RDA explanation, then you might argue that you can use the language and script of the title page here. Well, on the whole, I think it's a difficult and not very satisfactory description of this glue expression. Now, the working group, they were quite pleased with what they did because, among other things, they said, it's relatively easy to understand and apply. Well, it may be only me, but personally, I think it's really mind-blowing, especially this treatment of decisions, criteria, plans as works in the first place. And also what an aggregating expression really is. I'm still completely mystified because I still think it can't be the resulting aggregate. And also this putting together of two extremely different kinds of things, these ordinary apple works and the glue work, and say, well, these are so similar, we can put them together in one manifestation. So I think it's mind-boggling. They also said it's consistent with the Ferber model. Maybe so, but still it leads to very odd things. And one very odd thing is that variations which for ordinary apple works are considered to be on expression level are considered to be on work level for the aggregating works. And this, of course, leads to the equally odd work expression lock. So, for example, if you have a translation of an ordinary work, an apple work, it's just a new expression. But in my case of this edited collection on artificial intelligence, if I make a translation, I'll have a new work. Right, now let's have a look at the official toolkit. Of course, I looked there and I found this bit about describing an aggregate manifestation. And for example, there is this option where we are told that we can relate the aggregate manifestation to the aggregating expression using the element expression manifested, or we have something very similar for relating it to the aggregating work. Now, if you follow these links, there is no special guidance. So, for example, if you look at the element expression manifested, it tells you to record this element as title of expression, access point, identifier, or IRI. But there are no special options for how you do this for an aggregating expression. So at least I haven't found it. I haven't found a bit where we are told what is the preferred title, for example, of an aggregating expression. Now we can look further. Here we have describing an expression of an aggregating work, and we get options for how to give information about the creators and how to give information about the aggregated expressions. And by describing an aggregating work, we get information about how to give, we get an option about how to give information about the creators. So it's quite interesting to notice that the description is only in terms of relationships to other things, but there is no guidance given about attributes, especially, of course, about the question, what is the preferred title of such a thing? I wonder if this perhaps is done by intention, because it gives a lot of wiggle room. And now let me come finally to the new Library of Congress PCC practice, which, as far as I know, has not yet been implemented. I assume that that this is based on the task group on aggregates, the LCPCC task group, and their 2020 report, which is a very thorough discussion of problems and options. Right, now what did they come up with? Here we got this bit, and they explain very nicely the thing with the two models and which succeeded. And then they say, we have a new way of thinking, but the results should look more or less identical to what we always had. The only real change is this, that instead of using container of, we should now use expression manifested. So there is one actual change in cataloging practice, using different relationships in 700 for the aggregated works and expressions. And I think this is basically done in order to avoid the whole part terminology. If we look a little further, there is one example. It's not the same as my example of the edited collection. Rather, this is a collection of short stories where you also have a collective, conventional collective title. But still, I think this is quite useful. And now we find that the element expression manifested, as they say, is expressed in mark by using the 100 and the 240. So this bit is expression manifested. Now, if we compare this with my example of the edited collection on artificial intelligence, I think the expression manifested would be this. Right. So the interesting thing here is that, as you may all have noticed, there is no change. So the change is in wording only. So what they did, if I understood them correctly, is they just redefined what used to be the AAP for the aggregate work, which no longer exists, as the AAP for the aggregating expression. I mean, that's very clever, of course. That reminded me of a mail to RDA list in 2019 by Preston Salisbury. And looking back, I think Preston was really prophetic here, because he stated that for practical cataloging purposes, we are still allowed to behave as if there are aggregate works. One is allowed to treat the aggregating work in the same way as aggregate works have been treated, as long as the part of language is avoided. And he also said that the difference between aggregating and aggregate is so small as to be meaningless. Note that I think he's wrong there, because the difference is not small. The difference is huge. If you really understand the model, I think you must understand that it's two completely different things. But he's correct in what has happened to that. So the pros of this approach, of course, is catalogers would not have to learn many new things. It's just a very little change in their practical cataloging, which also means that there is no big divergence between old and new data. And of course, I mean, who wants to show a user something like a Miller's Zoo plan for edited collection and so on? So that's good, isn't it? But there are also cons. And I think if you really have understood the model and if you take it seriously, then this new solution is very difficult to reconcile with it, because it seems to mix up the new aggregating work and the old aggregate work. And I also would say that this makes it very difficult to teach. I've got no idea how I'm supposed to teach this. Also, it may be unclear to catalogers why they should need to learn about a fairly difficult theory. I think it's difficult if there are almost no practical changes. And you might even say this is cheating. Also, I think from what I have seen in this document, to me, it's unclear whether the WE lock is adhered to. And if it isn't, this would, of course, be a violation of the model. So finally, let's have a look at the WE lock. You'll remember what this means. If I have a collection aggregate like my edited collection, and I have, for example, a second revised edition where I don't know, changed the order or the articles were changed a little, then I have a different aggregating work. So if I catalog my second edition of Algorithms of Power like this, this doesn't really adhere to the model. So this solution violates the model because it implies the same aggregating expression and therefore the same aggregating work as the first edition. How could I solve that? Well, I think one solution would be to really put a 130 in there and differentiate the two editions. And then you might say, well, I still want to collocate them. And so you have to add another layer, the so-called work group. You will all have heard about this new concept in present RDA. Or you could say, well, I'm not changing the practice. I'm just changing the wording. And instead of work, you say, well, this addresses the work group. So both is possible, but I'd say that both lead to new entities, which don't really seem necessary. And in my opinion, and this is maybe one of my most important criticisms, the original further concept of a work is undermined if all these things are different works. And I wanted to remind you of William of Occam, the medieval philosopher, and you all know the principle of Occam's razor, which says that you shouldn't multiply entities unless there is really very good reason. And here I just don't see any. Right, so this is my last slide. So I think I'm still on time. My conclusion is, I think, of course, that's my personal opinion, and I'm sure I will be told later on that I'm completely wrong and I've misunderstood everything. But I think that there are inherent problems with the present aggregates model. And I don't think this is just restricted to MARC, because this rift between apples and glue and the need for an additional layer, the work group, I think they don't go away with BibFrame. but maybe Paul will tell us differently later. So I think it is time to have another look at the loser model, because I still think it fits much better with the intuitive understanding. It also complies with the principle of representation, because the editors and the publishers do not present this as a new work. They just present it as a second edition. So this is something which we've always thought is a difference in expression. Also, if you look at the loser model, the main criticism was that it doesn't capture the situation when a single work has been published independently and only later it becomes part of an aggregate work. Now, this is true. So this model makes it look like a work has always been part of an aggregate work. However, I think there is a similar problem with the winner model, because this doesn't capture the case which I took as an example, an edited collection, when really works are only get created to be part of an aggregate work. So I think both models have problems here. And I believe personally that the loser model could be adapted adequately and would then be a better basis for the description of aggregates. Right, and that's it. That's my input. So my last slide just has some references. And I'm going to stop sharing. Right, and I hope you could all follow me. I know it's been very complicated. Now I'm interested in your questions.
We have one question. Does the loser model ensures better the aspect of granularity as regards the representation of entities?
Oh, hang on. Not quite sure what is meant by aspect of granularity. Yeah, let me just say, it's quite some time ago, but in 2012, I spent a lot of time thinking about the loser model and about this problem, and I drew up lots of diagrams. And I think it is possible to capture this problem, which I tried to point out, that it makes it look as if a work has always been part of an aggregate work by adding, you have to add something by adding a new relationship between the work itself and its counterpart in aggregate. Maybe that's what Arjun means here. So I think it is possible. Right, I'm not sure whether I got the correction, whether I got the question correct. I hope I did. Yeah, granularity means yeah, I think so. I think you can manage a very faithful modeling of different cases. No, you don't have to apologize. All right.